Yep.
horrible.
Just
Oh, really? My lady was like,
words.
my
Yeah.
was like,
Yep.
that's stuff in my brain.
All right, gang, here we go. Let's get this party started. All right. Devotions for today. Devotions for today comes from the book of Psalms, chapter 9, and we hear the following. All right, Psalm 9 is also a prophecy of the people of Christ, the Holy Christian Church. They suffer following the example of Christ, and their blood is continually being shed. However, the psalm gives this prophecy, thankfully, and comfortingly so that we might well be called, or we might well call this a psalm of thanks and comfort. But the Christians, and especially those holy martyrs, here thank God and are comforted by the fact that God never leaves them. No, the more that they're persecuted, the more he multiplies the Christian, as some of the persecutors are converted and become Christians themselves, while the others perish. This psalm belongs to the first commandment and, again, the second petition, as we talked about last week. Hear the words of Psalm chapter 9. I will give thanks to the Lord with my whole heart, and I will recall all your wonderful deeds. I will be glad and exult in you, and I will sing praises to your name, O Most High. When my enemies turn back, they stumble and perish before your presence, for you have maintained my just cause. You have sat on the throne giving righteous judgment. You have rebuked the nations. You have made the wicked perish. You have blotted out their names forever and ever. The enemy came to an end in an everlasting ruin. Their cities you rooted out. The very memory of them is perished. For the Lord sits enthroned forever. He has established his throne for justice, and he judges the world with righteousness. He judges the people with uprightness. For the Lord is a stronghold for the oppressed and a stronghold in times of trouble. And those who know your name put their trust in you. For you, O Lord, have not forsaken those who seek you. That's Psalm 9, verses 1 through 10. Let's go look at the other section tomorrow. Let's pray. Blessed Lord, who caused the Holy Scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we might embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope of everlasting life that you have given us through our Savior, Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. All right. So, Friday, we started taking a look at the Inter-tesamental period, right? And I don't believe I gave you guys this on Friday, right? No? All right. Let's get that to you first, and we'll start moving along through this here. All right, here we go. So here is the dealio, right? The sheet that I just gave you here is useful for just giving you a quick overview of the material we're going to be talking about. I'm not expecting you to memorize everything on this sheet. I just want to go over this real quick. So some of this I'm going to rehash here in a moment, but just as a quick overview. The intertestamental period, as we talked about on Friday, right, is a period of approximately 400 years that ends with the life of Christ, right, the birth of Christ, as we move through. As you can see laid out in the sheet, right, it covers a whole series of time periods. The thing that I find kind of funny is sometimes scholars will call this the silent period or the silent years, but there's actually a lot of violence and bloodshed going on during this entire period. So as we take a look at this, right, it picks up really where you guys would have left off last year in the Old Testament, right, with the book of Malachi, the Persian rule, as the case may be. As we talked about last week, right, after the Persians, we see Alexander the Great coming through, right, and his Greek armies, they end up conquering the known world at that time, taking over and trying to make everything Greek. We talked about that idea. We'll talk about it again here in a minute. Alexander, right, we talked about he gets malaria while on campaign, ends up dying. His generals take over, right? Two of them are called Ptolemy and Seleucus. They are going to be really important. We'll talk about them in a moment. Basically, though, remember that at the end of the reign of Seleucus, one of his sons, Antiochus IV, ends up, great-grandson rather, but ends up causing lots of problems. The biggest of which is, well, he attempts to exterminate the Jews, right? And we'll talk about that again in a moment. Following that, right, if you flip it over to the backside, you'll see you've got the reign of the Maccabees, right? Remember, the ultimate thing that he does that's kind of goofy is he builds a statue of Zeus in the temple and sacrifices a pig to it, which, well, kind of makes the Jews unhappy, just a little bit or a lot. And one of the priests at the time is a guy by the name of Mattathias, right? He ends up actually grabbing a sword and leading a massive revolution against the Greeks there. And the Seleucid Empire is kicked out of Palestine. His family ends up ruling for a while. We call them the Hasmonean dynasty, or the Maccabean dynasty. And they are ended in 63 BC when Rome comes through, takes over, which sets us up for the events we're going to be talking about. All right. I just did this as a quick and easy overview in case you're struggling to remember how all of these things kind of relate together. The bolded section headings make it really convenient for keeping track of that. So, what are we doing today? Well, we're actually going to jump into and talk about the intertestamental period. There's going to be a lot of rehash about what I just said and just a little more detail. So we're going to take a look at that and see where we end up. All right. So, all right. So this actually starts your notes, which means when we get to a test on the testamental period, this is the first of so many documents that you'll be taking a look at. So let's do this. All right. So the intertestamental period. Intertestamental period. What do we got? Well, the first thing I want to do is give you just a quick timeline over this. All right. I know this timeline is a little bit difficult to read. The timeline itself isn't that important, but I throw it up here to just mainly try to illustrate for you how some of these things are related together. So over here, right, you've got Israel dividing in two. You all covered that last year, right? You got the northern and the southern kingdoms that come as a result of that, right? As you move across the timeline, eventually Israel is defeated by the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians come through. They destroy the temple in 587. As the case may be, right? You know, the Babylonians are taken over by the Persians, right? Right away at the Persian beginning, right, you've got Cyrus, king of Persia, who allows for the temple to be rebuilt. As the book progresses, right, you end up with the book of Malachi somewhere around the year 400 BC being written. But shortly after that, right, about 70-ish years, Alexander the Great comes through, conquers everything, starts this period we call the Hellenistic period, where they make everything Greek, right? And we end with this idea here, right? Antiochus IV, right? The Maccabean Revolution, the 100-year reign of the Maccabean independence, ending in 63 BC with Rome coming in. So again, a lot of the same stuff that we've kind of talked about as we've been moving forward, but good things to keep in mind, right? All of this stuff are things that we can actually plot out on a timeline. So let's actually jump to the notes themselves, right? What is the intertestamental period? Well, the intertestamental period is the approximate 400-year period of silence, right? Where God did not allow any prophets to speak. Right? As you can see, it basically goes from the reign of Nehemiah, ending obviously with the reign of Christ, when God sends his son somewhere around the year 5 BC, give or take a year or two there. So we're looking at an approximate 400-year reign, a little more than that. So 400 is a good enough number for what we're doing right now. All right. Now, you don't need to worry so much about the dates themselves. Just remember, right, the intertestamental period, or the silent time, right, is God's 400-year reign of silence, where he didn't send prophets. So, again, you kind of covered this last year, right? This should be a good review, right? The things that are happening just prior to this intertestamental period. You've got the northern kingdom being carried off into its destruction. Remember, the northern kingdom is completely annihilated and wiped out. The 10 northern tribes no longer exist, right? They were completely destroyed. They were destroyed by the Assyrian kingdom, 722 BC. Right, the Babylonians came in on their heels, right, destroying the southern kingdom in 586, and finally, right, the Persians restore everything in 538. Right. So a lot of things that you guys are already comfortable with, already know a lot about, but to kind of poison it, as you will, the good things that the Persians do. Once we get to the building of the temple, history starts to get a little bit gray and a little bit cloudy. We're not really sure a lot of things that happen once we pass the rebuilding of the temple, as it were, and the restoration of the land. But what we do end up finding out from a later historian, we'll call him Josephus, is that he doesn't like the Persians. That's about all we know. From about the year 450 to about the year 330, right, give or take, all we know is that the Persians are in control, and that it probably wasn't a good thing for the people of Israel. Right? Flavius Josephus, in case you aren't aware, we'll be talking about him a little bit more in some future lectures here. He's a first century Jewish historian. A lot of people in Rome were curious about this little backwater Jewish province and wanted to know how they got to where they were. And Josephus was hired to do just that. So he's kind of a Jewish historian that gives us some insight into this time period. But this is what we know. Josephus really doesn't have a good opinion of the Persian Empire, at least in its latter days. All right. So, where do we go from there? Well, you remember, right? After the Persians, we get to our good homeboy Alex, right? Everybody remembers Alexander the Great after I bring him up, right? Because we like to forget that history is all interconnected. Alexander the Great, remember, he conquered Palestine, right? He does this in about the year 332. Remember, Alexander the Great's greatest claim to fame, the reason you learn about him in every history class that looks at the ancient world, is because of one thing, right? He sought to make the whole world Greek, right? Even though he wasn't a Greek himself, he was so enthralled by Greek culture and architecture and advancements. He was like, yeah, we got to make the whole world Greek. Now, the question becomes, how did he do this? Well, don't worry, I'll tell you. Right? Making the whole world Greek is a process that we call Hellenization. Absolutely. Yes. Feel free to tell me to slow down. I'm excited about this stuff. Right? So he seeks to make the whole world Greek, right? He does this by a process that we call Hellenization. Also, second pro tip, just because I know, judging by the eye rolls and the great sigh that happened in the room just a little bit ago, I'm going to be throwing this stuff up on YouTube so you guys can go back and watch it later too. We got bogged down or slowed down here, all right? But I'm going to keep rolling through this. All right. So, Hellenization. Well, what is it, right? What is this idea of Hellenization? Well, Hellenization really encompasses three big things, right? Greek language, Greek philosophy, and Greek thought. Now, going hand in hand with that, right? One of the big things that we start to see coming to the forefront is this idea of Greek buildings, right? Now, the thing that I find really ironic or amusing maybe is that when our good friends the Romans come through, they pretty much adopt a lot of the Greek namings for things, and they just kind of Latinize them a little bit, which then gets passed down to us in English. For example, you all know what the gymnasia is, right? The gym, yes. The Latin version is the gymnasium, right? Which is what we call it even in the full anglicized format, right? The gym is, well, nothing more and nothing less than the place that you go to work out, right? It's a place that you go to work out. Same thing back then as it is now. Now, the workouts obviously were different, but the idea is the same. The theater, you already know what a theater is, right? We're building one next door. It's a place that you go to watch plays and dramas and oratory and the like, right? The last one, though, this one sometimes trips up a lot of the sophomores. The stadia.
A library.
Not quite. Stadium, right? And the stadium, as back then, as it is today, right, is simply the place you go to watch the games, right? Now, granted, back then it would have probably been something more like horse races or gladiator fights or, something to that effect, right? But the stadium, right, is the place you go to watch
Like
the game.
Is that a stadium?
The Coliseum is a stadium, yeah. There's some nuances we could talk about, but we're not going to do that right now. Okay, so the case in point for us in Israel is actually the city of Caesarea on the Mediterranean. They called it Caesarea Maritimia, which is literally Caesarea on the Mediterranean. Why? Well, because when Rome took over, everybody who was cool was like, hey, we want to name our city Caesarea. Why? Well, think about it for a second. What does Caesarea sound like? Caesar, right? It's literally what they're calling their names. Yeah, this is my city called Caesar in honor of Caesar.
Wait, what does Caesar have to do with anything?
He was the leader of Rome. Yep. It would be like saying, welcome to my city. We call it king. Why? Because we have a king. Good on ya.
Oh, so Caesar's not his name, that's just what they call him?
Correct. Yep.
Well,
Yep. Caesar Augustus simply
wait,
means
that's the same Caesar.
simply means King Augustus.
And Augustus is his last.
Nope.
So did I. Wait, is that the Caesar we're talking about? Caesar Augustus?
In this case, I believe this is a true statement. Yeah. I think so.
Whoa, I did not. That's so cool.
Yep. But just because it's a title, it would have been passed down, right? Yeah.
Well, I know
It's all
that.
So if you called your city president, right? That's like basically what's happening here. But because it's Latin, it sounds cool, right? So we keep it. All right. What else do we got? Oh, philosophy, right? You know these guys, Plato, Aristotle. I'm not going to jump a lot into their stuff because usually you guys hit that in science and history and other places. So just know that philosophy is a big part of that. And then astronomy, right? The study of the stars becomes really popular during this time period. All right. Now, unfortunately, right, tears and great sadness, Alexander the Great dies while on campaign in India, right? Catches malaria, those mosquitoes get you every time, right? But his four generals, right, his four top generals, end up splitting up his kingdom, right? The four generals, you can see their little territories broken out there, but the two that are really important are Ptolemy, right, the guy who took over Egypt, and Seleucus, the guy who took over pretty much everything else, right? You can actually see there from the chart, you see those little orange arrows. Eventually, Seleucus and his Seleucid army take over the other two territories. They retake Greece, retake Macedonia, and work their way into Europe a little bit there. And they end up taking over Israel eventually, but we'll get to that. So, the generals. right? So as you saw from the last map, the Ptolemies took over Egypt, which included at that time Israel, right? Palestine. Ptolemies was considerate of the Israelites. Basically, like most generals from this time period, it kind of was a deal of, hey, I'm your king, but as long as you pay me tributes, I kind of let you do whatever you want. And the Jews were okay with that. I mean, it kind of sucked to have to give up your stuff, but it's a lot better than being dead, right? So they dealt with it. But unfortunately, that was not the last, right? Because like I said, Seleucus and the Seleucid armies take them over eventually. And what happens is the Seleucid armies are at first considerate as well, right? And the Jews are like, oh, okay, we've been doing this. It's just a different name on the coin. Whoop-de-doo, right? No problem. And then we get down to the reigns of the Antiochus family, right? Antiochus IV, we talked about him on Friday, right? He's the one who creates a big problem for the Jews.
I could not remember his name because somehow Hitler came up in one of my conversations, and I was like, he's not even real. He stole all of his ideas.
Absolutely.
Calling him like.
That's a good shot.
Not my name.
Yep. Antiochus, though, right? Antiochus IV, right? He tries to eradicate the Jews. Now, he didn't do that overnight, right? He didn't wake up one morning and like, hey, I think I'm going to slaughter all the Jews today. But he did it slowly and over time, right? So he started off by doing things like prohibiting some of their practices, right? Circumcision, huge thing for the Jews, right? It's like the hallmark of their males of being God's people. Antiochus IV said, well, you know what? If you do that and I catch you doing that, you're all dying, right?
Really?
Yep. So
Why?
because that wasn't a Greek thing. Circumcision wasn't something that the Greeks practiced. I mean, it wasn't uncommon, but it wasn't something that they regularly did. In addition, right, he had book burning sessions, right? He destroyed their Torahs, threw them on the fire. He required sacrifices to Zeus, which, of course, you all know, right, the Jews couldn't do. And, yeah, I know my little window's kind of covering that a little bit. Sorry about that. But he also made a statue to Zeus and sacrificed a pig at the temple in Jerusalem. And that was the last straw, right? I mean, the Jews were not happy being killed. They weren't happy being killed because they were circumcising people. They weren't happy to be killed because they're, et cetera, et cetera. When he sacrifices the pig in the temple, he breaks pretty much all faith with them. And this guy comes into power, Mattathias, right? Mattathias is a priest in the temple at the time. And while the army has, imprisoned the priests in the temple there, and they're watching, this heathen pagan god, have a pig sacrificed in the holy temple, Mattathias decides, hey, I'm done. And so what he does is he grabs a sword from one of the guards, supposedly, and leads a revolution. And the Jews flock to his cause. And we have what is called the Maccabean Revolt. And what ends up happening as a result of that is an independent Jewish state, right? So the Jews become independent after Mattathias' revolt until 63 BC when the Romans take over, right? His reign, the reign of the events that happened here, was approximately 100 years when all is said and done. So it becomes kind of an interesting thing. He was able to throw off one of the major world powers at the time, right? You saw how big the Seleucid Empire was. And they reigned as an independent state until the Romans came in. So, what does that mean for us? Well, there's a couple of interesting things that come to the forefront. First off, is this idea of a Jewish legacy, right? So the last son of Mattathias dies, right? There's a guy named Simon, kind of an intriguing character. You can look him up on your own if you want to. But what ends up happening after he dies is the church becomes politicized. Basically, the people that take over are the priests, right, at the temple. They become the ones that are in charge. Now, this becomes vitally important because as part of that, right, the high priest becomes this solo figure that everyone looks to for rules and instructions and what is it we're supposed to do, right? And that becomes one of the lasting legacies that leads us into the first century, which is one of the reasons why, for example, the high priest Caiaphas was so worried about this Jesus character, because he was a threat to his power. Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later on.
Why did it just say Simon in parentheses?
That's the last son of Matthias.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Just gonna give him a shout out. Right. Second thing that I find that is really interesting about this time period is that the Jews start to become Hellenistic. Right. We talked about the Greek Old Testament, right? The Septuagint. That'll come up here in a second. But one of the other things that's really curious is that they start to follow some of the zodiac signs, right? And if you're all familiar with that, right, you know what I'm talking about. This is actually an example of this, right? This is a zodiac calendar on the floor of a synagogue temple.
I'm a Leo.
Exactly. I mean, as you can see, right? Whoa, okay, here you go. As you can see, right, here's the Pisces symbol, right?
Yep.
You know, you got the scorpion over here, and
Wait, which one's for Leo? The lion.
the lion, which I think is this guy here.
Looks like a squirrel. Looks like a cat.
You know, I mean,
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
not a lot they can really do with that. Anyway, so you start to see a lot of these things, right, kind of come into play, into being, and actually a lot of this stuff becomes really interesting for our studies in Revelation when we start to talk about ideas of I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So this becomes important for Revelation too, right? Because it sets the stage for how it is that people interacted with the world. We're gonna talk about some numerology stuff and how your names relate to different numbers and things. It's a process called gematria, and it all harkens back to this stuff. Right. Okay. So then we get to Rome. Right. My favorite is everyone's like, who's that guy? Well, technically this is kind of an anachronism because this is Julius Caesar leading his armies into Gaul, but it was the coolest picture I could find that kind of represented that. Yeah.
So why does he put his name before the Caesar if everyone else puts their name after
Caesar? It depends. So for example, one of the other Caesars is Nero, right? And he went by Nero Caesar. It has to do, I think, more so with probably some Latin grammatical things. That's just a guess.
What then?
Yeah, because that's what the Romans speak, Latin.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So no, they spoke Latin.
Oh.
Yep, that's all good. Sorry. All right. Okay. All right. So the Romans come in. All right. Yeah. General Pompey, right, enters. He takes over Jerusalem, 63 BC, right, which harkens the end of the Maccabean reign, the Hasmonean dynasty, as it's also called. Right. Now, history gets a little bit gray on this, right? Pompey tried to weasel his way out of it, so nonetheless, he was the general in charge, so the blame, I think, oftentimes gets stuck to him. What ends up happening is his soldiers, tired from all of their great military campaigns, tired of the siege of Jerusalem, which was a long, drawn-out thing. Interesting battle, if you're curious, look it up. I'm impressed by how the Romans won. But what ends up happening is Rome ends up getting into the city. They bust open the doors of the temple, and they're so tired of fighting that the priests try to make this grandiose last stand, and they just get slaughtered by the Roman legions. It is what it is. It is what it is. We'll talk a little bit more about how that all kind of comes about a little later on, but this is just a quick survey. All right, so the soldiers, right? The soldiers then enter the Holy of Holies, which, as you recall, was just an empty room behind a curtain, right? Because the Ark of the Covenant at this point was disappeared, right? Remember that that goes missing during the Babylonian era. Lots of wonderful guesses and assumptions about what happened to that, but nonetheless, it's gone at this point. So the soldiers take a peek behind the temple because they're like, wow, there's this cool curtain. There must be something important behind there. And, they peek behind it and there's nothing there. And they're like, what the heck? Like I said just a second ago, remember the Ark of the Covenant went missing during the Babylonian reign?
I don't remember that.
Yeah. All right. Pro tip: during the Babylonian captivity, right, when they take over Jerusalem and destroy the temple the first time, the Ark of the Covenant goes missing.
So you back?
No one knows where it's at.
Oh, I want to find it. It's gone forever.
There's like 3 competing theories that I've heard of right now. One of them is that the Babylonians melted it down. The second is that it was taken to Ethiopia, and the third is that it was hidden away on Mount Sinai.
I like that Ethiopia.
That's a kind of longer, drawn-out story, but the short version is that supposedly there was some envoy from Ethiopia who had heard about how great Solomon was back in the day, and so they had sent people as like envoys to find out like more about this Yahweh character, and they end up being entrusted with the ark when they hear the Babylonians are coming. No, so the Ethiopian account, supposedly there's a secret church that only this select tribe knows about, who are supposedly devout followers of Judaism, or technically it's an offshoot of Judaism, but
And it's still the 10 Commandments in it.
Would be my assumption,
That's so cool.
but they don't let anyone see it. So.
Sinai, wouldn't they have found it already?
Well, supposedly everyone who's tried has tragic accidents like helicopters crashing and boulders falling on them, and
I want to do that. That's so cool.
Not die,
but I want to go. God's protecting it
that's the wonderment.
by killing
So.
people. Oh, maybe not.
I don't know. It is what it is. I mean, so at any rate. Oh yeah, one last thing about Romans, right? So the Jews don't like them because they peek behind the temple curtain, Holy of Holies, and it ends up pouring rise to a group we talked about on Friday, right? The Zealots, who are kind of like Jewish assassins. So Romans basically get sick and tired of hanging out in Jerusalem. Why? Because they don't like being stabbed in the back. And so they actually mostly rule from regions from afar. So remember we talked about Caesarea Maritima before, right? That's where Pontius Pilate had set up his headquarters. And he just went to Jerusalem for festivals and things like that. But people like the Herods, remember Herod the Great, Herod Antipas, they ruled from palaces kind of from afar. All right. Let's see, literature. We talked about these 3 things on Friday, just to give you good spelling and definitions for those, right? So you've got the Septuagint, right? This comes out of this time period, right? From the Hellenization of the Jewish people. So you've got the Greek version of the Old Testament, which is if my memory serves, I believe it's the oldest copy of the scriptures, the Old Testament scriptures that we have. You have the Apocrypha, which we call the hidden books. That's what the word Apocrypha means, hidden. So these are books, like I talked about, that are more folklore, fables, things like the books of the Maccabees, Bell of the Dragon, etc., etc. You can find those in some copies of the scriptures, or you can actually get just the Apocrypha itself. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? You've got the Old Testament in its original language. So that will get us set up then for social developments tomorrow. We'll take a look at some of the popular groups, and we'll keep moving along through that. All right.
I don't know. Probably. We haven't had one.